Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think we've already been introduced, so let's dive in right into the discussion. And I want to start the panel with addressing the question contained in its very title: how will the global power be reshaped by technology? And I think the assumption here is that global power map will be reshaped by technology, but I'm not sure that's actually the case. And Martin, I want to address that question to you. Are we really talking about technology as much as technology regulation? That is, the government supporting, protecting its high-tech industries, and perhaps disadvantaging those industries belonging or associated with the competitor. What do you think?
Well, I think every word of your question is actually important. So the global power map is being rewritten. The hegemony between China and the US. It is, to a large part, driven by technology, and the USTR report of March 2018 recognizes that. That's a key battleground. Will it be redrawn by rivalry or by regulation? That's a tricky one. So there are 8 companies, 9 companies, 6 in America, 3 in China, that dominate many of the key technologies. So rival between companies is as important as rival between countries in this particular respect. I think in general the digital players have been given lots of freedom in both China and the US. Will it be shaped by regulation? It'll be shaped to some extent by trade, although digital trade is actually relatively unrestrained. I think some of the key variables are competition in developing markets. Chinese and US companies tend not to compete directly in the same markets. So competition in developing markets, and also maybe the overseas expansion plans of Chinese companies, which are still untested, still unfolding. So I think regulation, or let's say national technology strategy, will be one factor, but not the only factor.
Now, I want to say in advance that we also have 2 major businessmen here from China, and some of them are sensitive about discussing political issues. So I want to give you guys as much space as you want, because I'm more predisposed towards policy questions. Speaking of which, Arthur, for the last 40 years, the American policy vis-a-vis China has been described as constructive engagement. And I think the new president seems to be, at least rhetorically, set on changing that. The words we hear coming from the White House are sanctions, containment, a very, very bad deal, and so on. Has that change of tone and vocabulary in the White House affected you guys think about going on into the future? Has it affected how you discuss your strategies with your partners, with your clients, etc.?
Yeah, hi guys. We are a venture capital fund focusing on investing in China. We have some investment in the United States, but mostly in China. So to answer your question, that policy and attitude actually, we take it very positively, because now we can directly go to Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and tell the young talents, like, come back. So it's really good for us to draw talents back, because we can provide you a better solution and better support to expand your scale and your dream, probably. Yeah. So actually that's good for us. Yeah.
Now, William, if I may turn to you now, the American West Coast and the Chinese East Coast are now comparable in both capitalization, talent pool, influence, efficiency, what have you. Are they really pitted against one another? Are they really engaged in a direct competition? You've created one of, in fact, the largest China in video technology company. When you look beyond China, do you necessarily have to think about the American competition?
That's a very interesting question, because I started the company 6 years ago in Boston, which is actually in the US, and we collaborated with Harvard Innovation Lab to start building the technologies at front. But then we realized one fact, that the US market is much smaller than the Chinese market, And that was the reason I brought the company to China 4 years ago into Shanghai. And I think nowadays, I think from 2016, the total funding of venture capital in China exceeded the total venture capital in the US, which is a very interesting fact. And this is another number that the AI technology patents worldwide distribution, China actually contributes 37%, and whereas the number of the USA is only 24%. So we see that when Chinese market is a very segregated economy. It kind of, you can build your own technologies and you have your own market, you have your own commercial clients. But whereas in the United States, we see there are only a few players that are big players, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, there's Netflix. But a lot of small companies or innovative startups actually don't stand as a great chance as they stand before, like 10 years ago. So I think that is a big difference between Chinese market and US market right now. I think you have to turn this. Yeah.
Can you hear me, guys? Yeah. Can I follow up on what you just said? Because I want to glimpse a little bit beyond both the American and the Chinese markets. When you guys go beyond those two countries, do you necessarily compete for the same market share? Do you go into the same foreign markets when you want to expand? And do you expand in a similar fashion?
I see there are cooperation and there is competition. So if we're in, the CIIE, the China International Export is right now in Shanghai. And we see that nowadays we want to import a lot of technologies and IPs, intellectual properties, into China and build commercial nets on top of these in China. I see this is a big trend. And in terms of challenge or like competition, this is more towards the bottom technology algorithms. Because now I think there are some sensitive areas in China, such as military or some security data. In terms of these areas, I think there is competition in the bottom technologies, where Boston Dynamics, which is a company acquired by Google. Is it Google? Yes, I think it's Google. Or Apple. I think a couple years ago, it's a Boston company, and this company they put a lot of focus on military. And companies like this, I think they will compete with each other in the future because it's very sensitive, the things they're doing. But commercial companies, I see more cooperation than competition down the road.
Martin, can I turn to you now? Because we talked before the panel, and I was struck by what you said about how different the Chinese and the American foreign expansion really are. Expansion strategies really are. Can you talk more about that?
Well, you can ask the question, are China and America rivals in the area of technology? Yes, although jointly they dominate many areas now, including AI. And in some areas, actually, China's ahead. In some areas, America is ahead. For instance, in venture capital funding of AI, China is way ahead, probably way ahead in applications. America may be way ahead in, still ahead in some basic technologies, sort of the research-driven side of things. But for all of that, the competition is different and has an indirect character. So different, according to our research, so the American 6 dominant technology companies are more global. They tend to have the philosophy of rolling out a relatively standard model internationally. They tend to be quite technology as opposed to application focused. Whereas the Chinese companies are still more at this stage geared towards the domestic market, which is enormous, much more prone to collaboration in ecosystems, have come from a heritage of leapfrog because they were leapfrogging directly to mobile, for example, leapfrogging directly to digital payments. And therefore things tend to be very fast and very application-based. So indirect. And then geographically, of course, we don't really have much direct competition because a lot of Chinese technology companies are mainly focused on the domestic market. The American companies are generally focused on developed markets. The Chinese companies are just beginning to expand overseas. So probably if we have direct competition, it will be in somewhere like Indonesia, I would imagine. Although when we see that competition, the pattern of competition may be quite different. So the standard models competing against the more partnered ecosystem-based models of the Chinese. So in a sense, there is rivalry, but little direct competition at this stage.
But what I'm very interested in is, if I understood you correctly, is this very different approach with the Americans coming and essentially bringing the model that has worked so well for them in their own domestic market, and they're, from what I understood, far less prone to trying to localize and adapt it according to the realities in each particular country than the Chinese. Is that true?
I think that's somewhat true in my observation, and I attribute it to the heritage that Chinese companies, when they were developing the digital models, could not rely on the existence of things like a retail network, credit card information, credit card readers. So they had to form collaborative ecosystems from the very beginning. So the handful of examples we have of Chinese digital companies expanding overseas tend to be very collaborative, very partnered, very customized to the local conditions.
Now, Arthur, I know you dealt with mergers and acquisitions in the past. You now manage a large venture fund. So let me ask you a more general question about the Chinese investors' strategies over the last year or so. Chinese FDIs into North America plummeted by 92% last year. What explains this rapid divestment, and do you think it is permanent?
Maybe not, but our strategy is actually very interesting. We realize as the mobile trend go deep into the whole population of China, there are a lot of unveiled opportunities. What I mean by that is you just think about the white collar and blue collar people. Previously, it's only the white collar people, they have the access to the internet. But while now we have the mobile phone, all those blue collar people, we're talking about over 400 million people in China, they have the access to the internet. So there are a lot of opportunities just booming up. So our past year and this year, we are focusing on funding the new innovations for those people. Let me give you one quick example. So there is one company called PDD, P for Peter, D for dog. The PDD, which is listed recently in New York stock market. So this company has been set up, started like three and a half years ago. And now the valuation, market valuation is over $30 billion US. So what they do, they just leverage the WeChat, the Tencent product, WeChat platform. They do the group buy. So it's like, for example, we're living in the villages. So if one neighbor just send this link to our WeChat group, say, let's buy this television together, then we can just do it collaboratively. And the price may got like 50% off together. So this enormous power of those people kind of release a great opportunity for the business. So we focus a lot, not only buying the televisions, but also buying groceries, buying anything like you never see it before. Because previously, those people living in the villages, they don't have the access to the modern society, I guess. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that and bring a little bit of my own cultural baggage? Because we in Russia love to hate the Americans, but I think deep inside, more people in Russia do have more trust in the American legal system than they trust the Russian legal system. So I think they would have a not very articulated bias towards, for example, buying things American. Is that also true for China? Do people in those villages that you're talking about, are they more predisposed into investing their holdings into the Chinese companies or companies in the United States or somewhere else?
I don't think it's more kind of geographic driven. I think many people they tend to invest in the larger conglomerate, like just larger companies. So they invest in maybe Google, Facebook, JD, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, yeah.
So they would not have any bias or preference for, let's say, national champions as opposed to international champions.
Oh, you mean say champions? You mean products?
Yeah, I mean large companies. So you said Google or let's say some local Chinese company. They for them it's essentially size is the only thing that matters, not the jurisdiction where the company is located.
Yeah, I don't think they care. They care that much as long as it's good products. Mm-hmm. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. But generally, the local products are cheaper, mm-hmm. and we call it like consumption upgrade. So when we say it, for us, we tend to buy more kind of luxury stuff overseas, mm-hmm. in Europe, in United States. But for many other people, they just buy better products. Previously, you can buy only local ones. Now you can buy stuff from Beijing or Shanghai or some kind of more like just better products. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, I mentioned some data before about the Chinese investors divesting from the United States. And for those Chinese investors who haven't been spooked enough about the recent political developments, I want to recommend the book by Michael Pillsbury of the Hudson Institute, who appears to be a bit of an economic guru for the Trump administration, and who recommends very harsh, very discriminatory measures to be taken against the very essence of the Chinese industrial politics. I think there is a reason to believe that a lot of people in the Trump administration subscribe to that vision. And William, I want to ask you, is that something you worry about, that the Americans can roll out very punitive measures against your country in general and digital sector in China? And more broadly, how self-propelled is the Chinese technological momentum at this point? So if worse comes to worse, can China survive on its own?
That's a very tricky question. Well, yeah, I think there's definitely significance, or there's definitely some effects that we're going to see if U.S. are going to roll out some harsher measures or manipulations towards China. But I think, as I mentioned before, China market is very segregated. It's very self-supplied market, where we see a big trend is that you cannot imagine in the U.S. that the U.S. governments will invest in some good technology startups in the U.S. It's not going to happen, but this trend is happening right now in China. Now, there were 28 unicorns company, like AI technology companies in China, and a lot of them are actually supported or invested directly from the Chinese government. So we see that Chinese government is actually putting a lot of efforts into building the next big, like Google type of next generation of companies. And
from what I understand, that's also something that the Trump administration is very unhappy about, arguing that since the government has so much input into the local digital market, then it does not fully play by the rules of market economy, and therefore it provides assistance and subsidies to that sector. And this is something that disadvantages the United States. That's essentially the essence of their argument. So the question really is how open-ended the Trump grievances against China, if he decides to take measures against the very essence of the Chinese industrial policies.
I mean, I think he's already doing it.
You think it's already happening?
And China's doing well. You see, like the CIA, which is happening CIE, which is happening right now in China. I think more than 200 countries, they actually put their a lot of good big companies go to China and do the exhibition of the import, and this is and I think China is opening its door more and more to foreign companies. But there are also some really good Chinese local companies that are getting funding from the Chinese government, because I think this is if China wants to get to the next stage, I think I was watching a video this morning. Now China is going to exceed the total GDP by 2028 to be the largest economy in the world. I think if China, because China right now is on its way on doing this, and he needs to put in more investments and efforts to kind of give aid or help to his own companies. So I think both are happening at the same time. They're not contradicting with each other.
Martin, in your research, you focus a lot on competitiveness and resilience if worse comes to worse, and we witness not just a trade war, but a full-blown economic war. How resilient do you think companies on both sides are going to be?
Well, I'm not convinced that we are on the brink of a full-blown economic war. If you read at least the official account of the US trade strategy, it's to move away from championing multilateralism as an end in itself and to re-stress national interest. And that's quite understandable because there is technological rivalry and economic hegemony going on. That said, I mean, we're seeing a trending down of global growth rates. I mean, growth is harder and harder to attain, and an exacerbation of trade friction could slow down the game. But in terms of competitiveness, I think the lead of China and the US over, say, Europe is very, very clear. That's that's not going to change. And also in terms of the resilience of the Chinese economy, I think you mentioned the word self-propelled.
Yes.
I think on many dimensions it's self-propelled. It has an enormous domestic market. Growth is slowing down, but I think the third quarter growth was 6.5%, which is very high, of course, compared to other large countries. It actually dominates venture capital investment in AI, patents in AI. So it's not really at a stage of catching up. It's at a stage of more or less parity. Now, the individual companies, the large companies, scale as a sort of buffer against adversity. But as I think ahead about the basis on which companies will be competing, I say that they'll be competing in the 2020s on the rate of learning in scaling AI technologies to the level of an organization as opposed to a spot application. But I also say that they're competing on resilience because all of these things you're asking about today are highly uncertain. We just completed an exercise ranking companies according to their vitality for Fortune, the so-called Fortune Future 50. And the interesting thing about the list is, every company on that list is facing multiple risks and uncertainties. So, resilience does become a key issue. And I also say that companies will be competing actually on statesmanship, which is, as a strategist, I generally have spent most of my time thinking about the competitiveness of companies versus their rivals. But these, social, political factors actually, in some ways, dominate the game now. So the trade sanctions, and it's very complicated because, of course, you impose a tariff on something nowadays, and it's so intermingled that it's actually very complicated to work out who it's going to help and who it's going to harm. So these two gentlemen, I think you've run businesses in the US and you've been partially educated in the US, and it's not as simple as saying we're going to stop one country importing good A and into my country. The effects are multiple.
Isolating the pain point is
it's very complicated.
Martin mentioned studying abroad, and as I was preparing for this panel, I came across truly astounding statistics. Around 300,000 Chinese students attend American universities annually. They account for about 1/3 of all foreign students in the United States pursuing bachelor degrees and about 1/4 of master degrees in sciences, technologies, engineering, and math. And Arthur, you were once a student, a foreign student in the United States. You chose to come back to your country. How typical is this story, and how good is China in attracting its best and brightest back home and making them or encouraging them to invest that talent and knowledge in their own country?
I believe the government is trying very hard to do that because the booming of a society depends on the good people, the good system. And I'm actually one of those students coming back about 6 years ago. Yeah, I think there are more and more coming back because especially for the young people, you think about it, when you're at like 25, 26, where would you grow faster? I think that's a key issue. It's not about for now, it's about for the next 10 years, where you should allocate your time. Previously, a lot of Chinese people, they spend 6 to 8 years in the United States waiting for the green card, right? At that time, it was the right decision, I guess. But for the past 10 years, I think it's a waste of time. Because if you have those time, as I mentioned, for this like PDD and other companies, you got billions of dollars. You can buy any citizenship you want. It's just a, and I see the people who actually waiting, like in the United States, they're afraid of coming back to adapt to the faster, rapid growing system. I guess that's the reason, because when you walk every day, it's very hard for you to run. Yeah, if that's not dramatic enough, it's like when you are in the wheelchair every day. Sorry, let's not talk about it. So basically, for my fellow students, there's almost no change after 6 years when I come back. Like their life is static. It's like you still have the same car, you still live in the same apartment, you still have a very decent but very peaceful life. But this life is there's nothing changing for the next 20 years. So yeah, it's only when you jumped out of that box you can see the static status of that. So I hope I translate that. So that's why a lot of people, they don't like that. They want to come back to embrace the more uncertainty and the more potential with the growth of the society.
And if I may address my last question to William and continue with this theme of having an environment conducive to development, and you only have 1 minute to answer it because we're running out of time. I came across a McKinsey Global Institute report recently, which sounded surprisingly positive on the Chinese government giving its digital players enough freedom before introducing legislation, and also bringing them into the process of drafting that legislation and regulation. And that does not necessarily concur with the typical Western narrative about the Chinese government being very controlling and intrusive in all spheres of businesses. And I want to ask you, how skillful are the Chinese authorities in leveraging both freedom and controls in this strategic sector for their own perception of their country?
I think there's definitely more room for Chinese government to do this. But in new technologies such as AI or blockchains, we see that China actually had its room for the new companies to grow at first. And then, you know, when the market is fulfilled with like new companies that are kind of competing with each other in a bad way, then the Chinese government kind of steps in and try to put more legislation on it. And I think there's definitely like more things that the Chinese government is doing right now from what we can see in the blockchain, because nowadays blockchain, or what we call like bitcoins, these things in China are pretty much banned. But I think the reason for that is they kind of went over the bottom line, and China kind of put a stop on it. But for AI, for big data, for all these like new technologies, China is kind of very encouraging the companies to do well in these industries, and Chinese government is investing in these.
Well, guys, we are out of time. I hope you enjoyed the insights of our panels. Let's give them a short round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.